The New York Journal American claimed that those attending were traitors on the side of Soviet Russia, and since Miller was one of them, Death of a Salesman now stood, it explained, exposed as a work which strikes a shrewd blow against the values that have given our way of life its passion and validity. I have to keep reminding you, it's talking of Death of a Salesman here. If you think that Miller commanded the respect of American intellectuals, or even drama reviewers, it's worth considering what a number of them had to say about his work. And I'm afraid I'm just going to give you a number of quotations, because even now, having written it, I'm still amazed myself. Even his breakthrough play, All My Sons, which went on to win a major prize, was rescued by a single reviewer, Brooks Atkinson. Otherwise, the New York Herald Tribune dismissed it as a dud, and the Daily News Review was headed Little Happens in Backyard Drama. Mary McCarthy, who attended the Waldorf Conference to denounce Miller and others, attacked Death of a Salesman, a work which Stanley Kaufman, writing in the New Republic, found a flabby, occasionally false work. By 1971, Kaufman was referring to Miller as all munched out, while the following year he said that going to Arthur Miller's new play is like going to the funeral of a man you wish you could have liked more. The occasion seals your opinion because there is no hope of change. There had always, he said, been two Millers, the great dramatist in general opinion and the much lesser one, quote, in the opinion of the best critics, among whom he counted himself. And he suggested, however, that his international success, which was otherwise rather baffling to him, was because he improved in translation, which left the British in a rather equivocal position. Walter Kerr referred to him as wrapping about himself the cloak of seer, prophet, founding father, and dormitory prefect. So it was difficult to know whether it was proper to applaud or to genuflect before leaving the theatre. In 1964, writing seemingly inevitably in Partisan Review, which consistently attacked him, Susan Sontag commented on the intellectual weak-mindedness of After the Fall, saying it was belaboured, trite, wretched. Speaking of the price, Martin Gottfried, who later wrote a biography of Miller, saw it as old-fashioned, carelessly written, displaying Mr. Miller as a slackening artist. It may very well be, he said, sadly, that the playwright has had his day. The play he was talking about was the third longest-running play in Arthur Miller's career, incidentally. William Dean Howells once remarked that anyone can make an enemy, the problem is to keep him. And this was a skill that Miller had evidently acquired with respect to Robert Brustein, a major drama reviewer and head first of the Yale and then the Harvard drama departments, who over several decades conducted a sustained critique amounting almost to a vendetta. He accused Miller of turgid naturalism, of focusing on psychological man instead of turning toward the void, a gesture at once potentially liberating and fearful. In other words, Miller was not Samuel Beckett. He wasn't a paid-up member of the avant-garde, which Brustein was celebrating. For Brustein, Miller's talent was minor. After the Fall was scandalous. Incident of Vichy was an old dray horse about to be melted down for glue. In retrospect, he thought even Death of a Salesman was unimportant. He described it as a social realist melodrama about a man who is a victim of a ruthless, venal, and corrupt system, flawed by Miller's failure to tell us what Willy Loman sells. And incidentally, that was also one of Mary McCarthy's complaints. Anyone know what Hickey sells in The Iceman Cometh? Because he's a salesman. Hardly incapacitates the play in some way, and Miller had some very interesting things to say about what was in those suitcases. For Richard Gilman, Miller was a narrow realist with a hopeless aspiration to poetry and a moralist with greatly inadequate equipment for the projection of moral complexity. Only once, he said, in Death of a Salesman, did his powers prove commensurate with his theme, so that he was able to compose, quote, a flawed but representative image of an aspect of our experience. On one other time, in The Crucible, his deficient language achieved a transcendence through its borrowing from history. And that, said Richard Gilman, quote, is literally everything. A View from the Bridge was simply dismal. Incident of Vichy was windy, dated sermon about guilt and responsibility. And it's revealing and something of a shock to recall the virulence of the attacks on Miller, who was alternately seen as an antiquated irrelevance and a threat. An essay by Philip Ralph was called The Myth of Arthur Miller's Profundity. For the director and critic Herb Blau, writing a decade later, even his success in England could be accounted for by the enthusiasm of socialist directors, whose engagement with him was in simpler vein the association of a more objective kind of truth with the urgencies of social political theatre. Delmore Schwartz wrote in a review for Commentary, another magazine which consistently attacked Miller, he wrote of the retarded conscience of Arthur Miller, the ball player for whom Marilyn Monroe consented to be circumcised. As late as 1996, Leslie Fiedler, himself a former Trotskyite, described him as an overrated playwright whose dramas were as devious as his public life. And in some sense, this all came to a head in 1987 when Miller published his autobiography Time Bends. Time magazine found the book's structure odd and frustrating, and in a sentence that confirmed Miller's worst fears, insisted that Miller remains fascinating because he fulfilled an almost universal male daydream. He married Marilyn Monroe. That was a review, Time magazine. The Times complained of a lack of any reference to Yves Montand, whose adulterous relationship with Marilyn had played its role in ending Miller's second marriage. The reviewer reiterated a familiar criticism of the Crucible, familiar, that is, from the attacks from the non-communist left. What does not come out here, it said, in Mr. Miller's 1953 play about the Salem witch trials, is that behind McCarthyism and the unscrupulous and publicity-seeking Hewitt investigations lay not giggling girls and a widespread belief in witches, but a genuine international conspiracy that threatened Europe at the time, even if it didn't threaten the United States. Mr. Miller has never been moved to write a play comparable to the novels 1984 or Darkness at Noon. Now, for Miller, this must have had a weary sound, as he was denounced for failing to embrace a militant anti-communism early enough. Darkness at Noon, after all, had been distributed by the British Foreign Office, while Koestler travelled America in 1948, urging radicals to support the anti-communist cause precisely when Miller had been voting for the communist-backed Henry Wallace as president. He was the third-party candidate in 1948. Nonetheless, the Times offered him a much more comfortable read than the reviews in Vanity Fair, The New Republic, and his old enemy Commentary. Vanity Fair just dismissed the book, saying Arthur Miller's sermonettes come straight from the gassy void. So that was Vanity Fair. James Tuttleton, incidentally an academic as well as a reviewer, in Commentary, of course, launched an all-out attack. He found the book full of what he called psychoanalytic palaver, which extended to his approach to politics. Are we seriously to believe, Tuttleton asked, that our century's horde of revolutionary Marxists who have destroyed whole societies and murdered huge populations have been merely the maladjusted products of Oedipal problems with Dad? Or that this explains the Marxist political motivation of guilt-ridden middle-class intellectuals like Miller? The weakness of his recent work, he said, Creation of the World and Other Business, The Archbishop's Ceiling, American Clock, Danger of Memory, had left him, quote, wondering whether his appropriation of this Freudian structure of ideas might not have drained his powers as a playwright.